Hello and welcome to GCSE Infection and Response with Mrs. Castanera. We are on lesson 9 and 10. So lesson 9, how much of the content can I remember so far? Lesson 10, how do vaccinations cause immunity against disease? So lesson 9 is very simple. It is literally the synoptic assessment, which is 2 pages worth of questions. There are a lot of them. Okay, there are 60 questions. I want you to go through and find out what all the answers are. Use the knowledge check questions to help you. Use the text to help you if you get stuck. Feel free to ask your teacher, email your teacher for help. And you need to make sure that you can answer all of those questions. Have a go without looking at the answers. Check your work, look up the answers, correct them, and then maybe have another go at the questions you got wrong. Lesson 10, vaccination. So today's keywords are vaccination, pathogen, white blood cell, antibody, and immunisation. So to start our lesson off, I would like you all to complete the knowledge check activity, please, and pause the video whilst you do this. Okay, let's go through that. Question 1. State the main task of the first line of defence. So that was keep the pathogens out of the body. Question 2. Identify the function of mucus. So mucus traps the pathogens. Question 3. State the function of white blood cells. So their role is to fight off and destroy the pathogens. Question 4. Explain what a toxin does to your body. So toxins are produced by pathogens and they are damaging to the cells. So it's essentially a poison, and it poisons and damages the tissues and cells. Question 5. Identify what cell produces an antigen. So white blood cells produce antigens. It's specifically the leukocytes. Just white blood cells is sufficient. If you've written leukocytes, that's wonderful. Question 6. State what the function is of an antibody. So antibodies are there to bind to the pathogens, so actually to the antigens on the outside of the pathogens. So the antigens are like little spikes on the outside of the pathogen, and an antibody is essentially a nice cap to go on that spike to make sure it can no longer be used. Question 7. State how protists infect an organism. So they use vector transmission. So the protist is picked up by the vector. So an infected organism gets bitten maybe by a mosquito or something, and the protist is inside the mosquito, not causing any damage, not infecting the mosquito. Then it goes and lands on another organism and infects it by injecting some of the protist into the body, which is what mosquitoes do to numb your skin when they bite you so you can't tell they're biting you. Question 8. State the 3 types of blood vessels. So these are arteries, veins, and capillaries. So make sure you've used a pen and another colour to mark your work. Correct it where necessary, so write in any corrections. Cross it if you didn't write an answer and then write your correction in, so it's obvious which one is your corrected answer. And give yourself a mark out of 8. So we've had all of these questions before. So if you have got 5 or less, then you really need to have another look at these questions because you should know most of these by now. If you have got 7 or 8, you're doing very well. Well done. So today's lesson, we are going to be doing the following. We're going to understand and explain how vaccines work in an individual, so in one person, and we're going to assess implication for wider populations' collective immunity. So what that means is we're going to look at how immunisation in individuals affects the immunity of a whole population system. So, moving on to the next page, it's dead? Well, almost. When you were younger, you were all given injections. These are called vaccinations. The reason for this is to protect you and not to hurt you, as you might think. Okay, and so when a pathogen infects you, what it does is it takes our bodies a few days to produce enough antibodies to fight that pathogen, because you need to have the correct antibodies exactly specific to that type of pathogen. So old antibodies for something completely different won't work. So if you get the flu, eventually a few days later, you'll develop flu antibodies. And if you get coronavirus, for example, you'll develop coronavirus antibodies. But the flu antibodies won't work on coronavirus, and coronavirus won't work on the flu. So you have to have the specific antibodies for the specific pathogen. And that takes a few days, sometimes longer, but it takes your body some time to produce these antibodies, enough of them to fight the specific infection. So during that time, you become ill. You feel the effects of it. So if you're already protected, your immune response is quicker. So talking about that example of the flu is quite serious for some people, particularly older people or those with a weak immune system. And so their bodies aren't necessarily going to have enough time to develop those antibodies before it gets too serious and puts them in hospital. So what we do is every year we give them a flu vaccine, the flu jab. And the flu jab gives them some antibodies, or it helps them develop antibodies usually, before they get the flu. So by the time they actually come into contact with the flu, they've already got some antibodies, their body's already remembered how to fight off the flu, and so they are already protected and they have a much quicker immune response. And so that's how vaccines work as a general level. Okay, so this vaccine is the protection. Okay, so the protection comes from the vaccination. So at this point, there are two videos you can watch. I recommend you watch both of them, please. And if you just write a little note on your in your notes or whatever, saying that there are two videos. So I'll put the links up on the page here in a moment. And if you watch these two videos, and that'll review everything we're about to cover. So as you will have seen in the videos, a vaccine is a biological preparation that contains dead or inactive forms of the pathogen. The pathogens all have specific antigens, those little spikes, on their surface. And these cause your white blood cells to produce antibodies. Even though the injected form that you're given with your vaccine is dead or inactive, they still have the antigens, and so our bodies still react to them as if they were alive, and so we still create an immune response despite them being harmless. So we're tricking our body into producing these antibodies. So your body then creates a response, which is the antibodies, and then it keeps a memory of that response. That's very important. And we call these memory cells. Therefore, if you are infected by the same pathogen, so a live version this time, your body will be able to rapidly produce, which is what it couldn't do before, and deploy those specific antibodies to prevent a major illness. And we call this acquired immunity. And when we say acquired, it means it's something we have gained because we've gained that immunity ourselves separately. So here is a small diagram, which I'm going to zoom into somewhat. Okay, so here is a diagram to show this process. It's much better shown and explained in the video you've just watched. So here are the pathogens. They're very weakened. Okay, they've been injected from the vaccination. And then here are the little antibodies that are going to connect onto the outside of these pathogens. And the white blood cells are producing the antibodies. So then later on, you're going to remember these, you see, your body will keep a memory of these antibodies. Later on, if you get the real live measles pathogens, your body has got the memory cells left, and those memory cells produced thousands and thousands of these antibodies that quickly they recognise and attack the measles pathogen, and then you don't get measles, you don't get ill, it's as though you've already had it and you are immune. So this is what we mean by acquired immunity. And this is how vaccinations work. So moving on to the pros and cons. This was covered in the videos, so I strongly recommend watching them. So there's always controversy over vaccinations, with people arguing for both sides. So when we say controversy, we mean that it's controversial, that it's argued about, people have differing opinions. They have very differing opinions when it comes to vaccinations, and people will argue for both sides. The best thing you can do is weigh up the good and bad things about them and make an informed decision. So let's find out the information and make the best decision for ourselves, rather than believing what other people tell us. Look at the evidence and decide. So the pros of vaccinations. So vaccines help control lots of dangerous and deadly diseases. So without vaccines, we'd have polio and we'd have smallpox, two very serious illnesses. So polio, if you wanted to look it up on the internet, polio causes all sorts of problems with growth and bones, and it's very, very unpleasant, and it gives people lifelong disabilities. Smallpox kills people rapidly. It's a very nasty disease. And there are many other diseases such as measles. There's even a chickenpox vaccine these days. So the diseases that were always just standard part of people's lives sort of 20, 30 years ago, they don't have to be around as much now because people can be immune to them because of vaccines. Then we have epidemics, which is what we currently have with coronavirus. So that is a large outbreak of one disease, and we can prevent these if large percentages of the population are immune. Okay, so that's really important, and we do this through vaccination. That's why at the moment people are incredibly worried about the fact that there isn't a coronavirus vaccination yet, and they're also working really hard in all the different countries across the world to develop a good vaccination to prevent the coronavirus epidemic continuing. So the quicker they get that vaccination and the more effective the vaccination is, then the quicker we can get rid of this horrible disease that's killing many people across the world. So another way to have large percentages of the population being immune is when they've had it. So again, we see this with coronavirus. People who have had the disease generally appear to be immune to it, and that's the case with most diseases. It's quite rare to have diseases you can catch multiple times with the exact same disease. So there are some diseases that appear that you can get them many times, such as the flu, because people can get the flu year on year, even if they've had the flu vaccine. That's why you have to have a new flu vaccine every year. And that's because the flu is a virus that changes, it mutates. So when it mutates and changes, it's no longer the same disease. It's a very similar one, but it's not the same. And it's those antigens on the surface of that virus, those little spikes, that are changing, and they are mutating and evolving. So each year you will need to have a new vaccine against the flu. So even though we say, once you've been vaccinated, you can't catch that disease, there are different versions of some diseases, such as flu. It's generally viruses that can change more than bacteria, or they become mutated and they change sufficiently to be needing a new vaccine. Okay, so the cons. So vaccines don't work 100% of the time. They work a lot of the time, and some vaccines are more effective than others. So when we talked about needing an effective vaccine for coronavirus, that means that it needs to work on a lot of people, most people really. Otherwise, there's not much point producing it and spending the money when people are still going to get sick. So the measles vaccination, as part of the MMR, works on the vast majority of people, but there are a very small number of people who will still get it. Other things that occur with vaccines is that over time they can become less effective. Those memory cells your body keeps to remember that pathogen, after a while there are less and less of them. And I say a while, I'm talking about 10, 20, 30 years. It depends on the vaccination. So there is a vaccination you can have to stop you getting pneumonia, for instance. It's called a pneumovax. That one lasts about 5 years, maybe 10. But for people that are at risk of getting pneumonia, so people who have issues with their lungs or likely to be very vulnerable to getting pneumonia, then they would have that vaccination every 5 to 10 years. Most people wouldn't have that because most people have strong lungs and they don't have problems. But some people need that and they will need to have that regularly. Other times there is such as the hepatitis vaccination that people who work in hospitals, such as doctors and nurses and that, they will often have to have those maybe every 10, 20 years. Sometimes you'll need to have a vaccination on multiple occasions over a short period of time. So the MMR, measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, children are given between the ages of 12 and 15 months. Now, they're given their first shot, then they're given another vaccination later on, a few weeks later, and then maybe another year or 6 months later, or even several years later for some vaccinations, they do their third one. And that makes sure that your body remembers those really well. And we do that for some of the more serious illnesses where we can't afford for the body to forget or lose those memory cells. So vaccines don't always work 100% of the time for a variety of reasons, but generally they are very effective. Some people can have a reaction to the vaccine. Now these are incredibly rare. Usually people that react to vaccines actually have other allergies, and it's not the vaccine they're reacting to most of the time, it's actually an ingredient in the vaccination. So quite a lot of vaccines are made maybe using eggs because they have to grow the antibodies. Sorry, they have to grow the pathogen to give them out. And so people who are allergic to eggs quite often will be allergic to vaccines as well. They'll have a reaction because the vaccine's made with eggs. And sometimes, because we give vaccinations to very young babies, sometimes the first reaction to eggs this person or child may have is some of their earliest vaccinations because they're done using eggs as an ingredient. There are other types of reaction to vaccine that people can have. So, for example, they may, for whatever reason, have a very sensitive immune system and they may have an extremely strong reaction to a vaccination. And this is incredibly rare. And usually it's because the person has another problem going on with their immune system anyway. And so vaccinations perhaps aren't suitable for that person. So there's a lot of pros and cons. That's the general list. So the next thing to do is to look at the data. So for example, measles. This disease causes major complications for 1 in 15 patients. So major complications, we'll talk about what that means in a moment. And 1 in 500 will die from it. So vaccine complications occur in 1 in a million cases. So at this point, we have to weigh up the pros and cons here. So measles will give 1 in 15 patients a major complication, so that's something significant that will affect them for the rest of their life, and 1 in 500 will die from it. That's a lot of dead and permanently affected people. However, if you give that vaccination to 1,000 people, only one of them will have a complication from it. Okay, and that complication may be a minor complication, it may be a major complication, or it might be that they die. We don't know. However, 1 in a million people getting a complication from a vaccine versus 1 in 15 people having major complications and 1 in 500 dying from the disease, it's very easy to see why we vaccinate, because it's just so much safer. And actually, measles killed many children in childhood. Most people, say in the 40s and 50s, would have known someone who had a child that died from measles. Some families had multiple children die when the whole family got measles. So it's a very serious illness. So let's talk about these major complications, and we'll write a little note about these because I think that's really serious, that we understand what they are. Put this in so you can all see it. So, major complications of measles. So first of all, hearing loss. About 1 in 10 children who get measles will have a serious ear infection, and often this results in permanent hearing loss, so becoming deaf in one or more ears. Also, there's quite common to get diarrhea, and so you can get dehydrated, which is quite a severe symptom because it causes a lot of other problems and makes the actual illness itself much worse as well. Pneumonia, which is an infection of the lungs, very serious. Encephalitis, this is a very serious one, where the swelling of the brain swells up, and that is probably one of the most ones that can cause you to have convulsions or fits. It can leave you deaf, it can give you permanent intellectual disability, you can die from it or be permanently disabled from it, so it's very, very serious. So we're going to call it encephalitis, which is the correct name, which is brain swelling. And that alone is incredibly serious. That leads to long-term permanent disabilities. So I'll just leave this on the screen so you can pause it to get all that written down if necessary. So moving on to the checkpoint activity. The best way to prevent the spread of measles is through a national vaccination programme. So that means across the whole country where everybody gets vaccinated at a certain age. Describe how the measles vaccine works, and that is worth 4 marks. So 4 marks, you say 4 separate things about how this vaccine works. So you need to talk about what goes into the body, what this makes happen inside the body, and then how the body then has immunity against the measles in the future. So pause the video whilst you answer those questions, and then we'll go through them. Okay, let's go through that. So you can have any 4 of the following 7 points. So something along the lines of a dead, inactive or weakened pathogen is introduced to the body or injected into the body. Then that the body recognises it as being foreign or unknown to it. That the white blood cells trigger an immune response. Then the white blood cells produce antibodies, or they respond by producing antibodies. The idea that these antibodies are very specific to that pathogen, so you have to have the right antibodies for the job. Then the idea that the antibodies are produced quickly when you're reinfected because you've already done the complicated long slow part, or that there is a rapid response when you're infected again. And then another point about antibodies are produced in large quantities, so you make lots and lots of them rather than just a few, or slowly, so that's good. And then the idea is that they kill off the pathogen. So any of these points up to a mark of 4, please. So give yourself a mark out of 4 for that, please. So that was quite a tricky question. So if you've got 3 or 4 out of 4, you've done exceptionally well. Don't worry if you didn't get all of those points, but I recommend everybody writes down all of those points if they can, and that way you'll know how to answer this question in the future. So your final task is to complete the knowledge check, please. There are 10 questions. Pause the video whilst you do this. Okay, let's go through those. Question 1. Define the term vaccine. So a vaccine is a biological preparation that contains dead or inactive forms of pathogens. Question 2. Identify the difference between vaccination and immunisation. So these days we use the term vaccination and immunisation synonymously. So essentially it's the same thing, we swap them around, it always tends to mean the same. Historically and scientifically there is a slight difference. Vaccination is essentially the safer option. So if you give someone a vaccination, there is no way of them actually getting the disease from that injection. Whereas if you do immunisation, that's usually through the process of inoculation. So inoculation is giving someone a live disease, a small amount of it, but very much alive. So it's not safe and you can get ill from that. So it's essentially a level of safety. It is possible to get ill through the process of immunisation. It is not possible to get ill through the process of vaccination. Okay, so vaccination is safer and uses dead or inactive pathogens. Immunisation can use live pathogens, so it is not as safe. I am very aware this answer does not fit in the box and I apologise for that. Question 3. Identify which part of the pathogen is recognised by the white blood cell. So that would be the antigen on its surface. So pathogens are covered in antigens, and it's the antigens that are recognised by the white blood cell. Those are little spikes on the outside. State one pro for vaccinations. So there are lots of sensible answers to this. It prevents epidemics. It helps prevent outbreaks of deadly diseases. It stops people dying. There's lots and lots of reasons. So essentially, stops dangerous deadly diseases, but any of the ones I mentioned would be fine. Question 5. Identify a negative effect of vaccines. So you might have written that they don't work 100% of the time, or you can have a reaction to them. Either of those is absolutely fine. You may have also written that they don't always last for the full lifetime of the person, which is also true. Question 6. Identify the 4 main types of pathogen. So we have bacteria, virus, fungus and protist. Question 7. Define the term benign. So benign is a tumour that does not spread. Question 8. State why a virus is not alive. So that's because it does not do all 7 of the processes required for life outlined by the mnemonic Mrs. Gren. To recap, these 7 processes are movement, respiration, sensitivity, growth, reproduction, excretion, and nutrition. Question 9. Suggest why, if a large percentage of the population are vaccinated against a pathogen, the spread of that pathogen would be reduced. So if a large percentage of the population is vaccinated, then most people would not be able to get the disease and pass it on. They would get the disease and immediately fight it off and not be able to spread it. So the key idea here is that people would be immune, and when you're immune, you can't spread it. Question 10. Why are diseases such as tuberculosis increasing in incidence in the UK when they were vaccinated against? Okay, so this one is a more complex one, which we haven't actually really covered in this lesson. It was briefly mentioned in one of the videos. However, TB is something that children in this country are vaccinated against. However, it is not 100% effective as a vaccination, and there are a number of people coming in from other countries who have moved here during their lifetime, and they get tuberculosis, or more often they'll bring it with them. And so there are areas, typically within city centres, where people are living in overcrowded accommodation, and tuberculosis is spreading between those people because they haven't been immunised and they have brought it with them from wherever they live, where they don't do tuberculosis immunisation. They're also spreading it amongst the people in this country who are unable to be vaccinated against tuberculosis, where they would be normally protected by herd immunity, which is most people have been vaccinated against it, and they're spreading it amongst them and the people whose vaccination hasn't worked or is no longer fully functioning. So we'll write that there are several reasons, and any one of these is fine. So first is immigration from countries with TB or no vaccination for TB. Another is spreading between people in overcrowded accommodation. Space to write the third one, which was that it would spread from these people that have brought TB with them or got TB from them in overcrowded accommodation to other people whose immunisation hasn't worked or has essentially run out. Give yourself a mark out of 10 for this. Now, many of these questions haven't been asked before, actually, really, or they've been asked a while ago. So if you got more than 5 out of 10, you're doing pretty well. I would recommend just reviewing the questions in the previous knowledge check, so the big lesson 9 big knowledge check. Go through that and have a go at those again. If you have got 8 or more, you're doing very well. Well done. So there are some keywords here at the bottom of the lesson. I recommend you learn those, and that concludes our lesson. Thank you very much.